Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. In the United States and many other countries, money has long been a driving force in politics, influencing who wins elections, which policies get advanced, and whose voices carry weight. From campaign donations to corporate lobbying, financial power shapes the political landscape, often determining outcomes, sometimes well before voters have their say. There are two new books that focus on the role that money plays in influencing politics in the US and the structures that make it possible. And today I'm joined by by the authors of those two books, Julian Heissler and Ray Madoff. Julian is the international correspondent for Wirtschaftswoche based in Berlin. And from 2018 until just a few weeks ago, he reported from Washington, D.C. as the Wirtschaftswoche's U.S. correspondent. Just last month, his second book was published. It's titled Amerikas Oligarchen, Geld, Macht und der Zerfall der Demokratie. America's Oligarchs, Money, Power, and the Collapse of Democracy. Julian, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you so much, Steve. Really enjoy being with you.
It's great to see you, and I'm glad that we have an opportunity to talk about your book, but also to talk about Ray's book. Ray is a professor at Boston College Law School. She teaches and writes on philanthropy policy, taxes, property, and estate planning. And her most recent book is titled The Second Estate: How the Tax Code Made an American Aristocracy. It was also published last month. Ray, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I knew about Julian's book because we talked about it before he left Washington. And I sort of stumbled upon your book, Ray, when I was listening to the radio and heard an interview with you. And I thought I would love to bring the two of you together to have this conversation. So I thought to have this conversation because I think you comment at some of the same issues, but from somewhat different perspectives, and that you would complement each other very, very well. And so I'd like to start by asking each of you to give us a sort of a thumbnail sketch of your book and what prompted you to write it now. Julian, maybe let's start with you. America's Oligarchs. What is your book about, and why did you think you should put it to paper?
So, I feel like money in politics has been a very close relationship in the United States for a very long time. And through my 8 years of covering Washington and American politics, it sort of always came up again, but I have never seen it sort of so much on display as we had in the first months of this year, with Elon Musk's role, excuse me, in the administration as an informal government employee, and the extent of power he wielded in this time. And I thought it would be a good opportunity for me to broaden the lens a little bit and look how money and politics have interplayed since pretty much the founding of the republic. So the book starts out by looking at Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and other oligarchs or other very rich individuals in the current moment and how they're shaping politics in the United States. But then it looks back at how this relationship has been integral into understanding how this wonderful nation has developed over the centuries at this point. And I thought this would be a project worth undertaking, especially at the current moment.
Let me ask a quick follow-up. I mean, I think it's interesting that you took this, historical perspective, if you will. But do you feel like there was a fundamental shift or a fundamental change that sort of drew you? You talked about Elon Musk's role in the current administration at the beginning of the year, but was there anything else that served as a catalyst for honing in on this right now?
So I guess the fact that it's been so overt at this point, it hasn't been this overt in a long, long time. And during my writing process, there was this election in Wisconsin. Some of you might remember when there was a seat up at the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, and Elon Musk actively campaigned. I think he was wearing a cheese head at one point, going into the audience and pumping an unheard of amount of money into this judicial race. And he was soundly rejected. His candidate, Wisconsin is obviously like known for its close election outcomes. His candidate lost in what can only be described as a landslide for Wisconsin standards. And this gave me the feeling, I was already writing at this point, that there's like a backlash to this current moment developing. But during my research, I came to the conclusion that a backlash might not be enough in order to overcome the current moment. So, yeah.
And Ray, in your book, you sort of hone in on some of the structural factors that might make the developments and trends possible that Julian's talking about. I mean, of course, Julian is talking about oligarchs, but in your book, you talk about an American aristocracy and how the tax code sort of enabled that to happen. Tell us a little bit about your book and why you decided to write it now.
Yes, so I've always been interested in the disconnect between what the law says it's doing and what it actually does. And nowhere is this disconnect greater than when it comes to taxing the rich under American tax law, because our tax system, the income tax and the estate tax, were enacted in 1913 and 1916 with the specific intention of imposing its greatest burdens on the wealthiest Americans. The idea was that those with the greatest capacity to pay should pay more than others. And this same system is in place today, right? So now it's more than 100 years later. We still have a progressive income tax. We still have an estate tax on the book. But what has happened is that a number of transformations have occurred over the past 40 years in which the richest Americans have essentially written themselves out of the tax system. They are able to avoid taxes altogether by following what I call the tax avoidance playbook. And what's amazing is that this is something that is anathema to our system as it is stated to be. And most people think that most people are paying a lot of taxes, and they imagine that other people with more must be paying more. But in fact, that's not the case. So it's a book that really explores that disconnect and how we, like the second estate, of course, refers to the aristocracy of pre-revolutionary France, and they were explicitly written out of the tax system. What happens here is that it has happened under the darkness of night.
So how can one shine some light on that?
Yes, that's the goal of the book. So one of the reasons that it's challenging is that, and this might be true in Germany as well as the United States, I find it hard to believe, but not everyone finds taxes that interesting. Some people think they're going to be boring, complicated, too many numbers, and so they don't really think that it is for the regular layperson to get involved. And this is what enables these bad policies to develop, is because people assume that the tax system is working better than it is, or if it's not, it's because of highly complex things that you couldn't do anything about anyway. But in fact, what I show in the book is that it's really just due to the basic structure of our rules, some really basic provisions that the wealthiest Americans have been able to be written out of the tax system. And it's basically because we heavily tax wages, but we don't tax investments and inheritances, which is, of course, the source of wealth for the wealthiest Americans. And it's this divide that I write about in the book. And my hope is that by educating the public and making them see that this is a very easy to understand. The book is short. It has big print. It has funny parts. It's designed to say, like, this is really for everybody to read and understand.
I mean, I think both of you have some interesting anecdotes, and what both of you are talking about is really the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few and the kind of influence that then gives. Ray, in your book, you argue that concentration is not a good thing, and I would guess that there are some people who wouldn't necessarily agree with that. They would say concentrating wealth is a good thing and that they want their wealth to accumulate in that way because it creates opportunities for them. Can you talk a little bit about where the problem is with the accumulation of wealth in that way?
Sure. The problem, and I think that's you raise a really interesting point, because when we talk about taxes, people say, well, you're just trying to make government bigger or something like that. But what I'm really concerned about is the allocation of the tax burden, not the size of the government. And so no matter however big we decide the company should be, it seems to me that everybody should be a participant in supporting the costs of government. And the problem that we have now is that for people who have jobs or are self-employed, gig workers, or anybody who works for their money, they move 2 steps forward and 1 step back, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But once somebody has acquired enough wealth that they don't need to have a salary, they can move 2 steps forward, 2 steps forward, 4 steps forward, 6 steps forward. So what we're doing is we are creating a tax-free glide path for the people who need it most. And that's just simply not fair.
Mm-hmm. I think some people might argue that this is sort of a natural feature of capitalism. Would you say that that's the case?
No, I would say that I'd say that Americans have been led to believe that capitalism works for everyone because rich people will pay more taxes than everyone else. And I think that's been the justification for capitalism in the United States. And that's why whenever you hear about taxing the rich, you'll often hear this statistic being put forward. They'll say, like from the Wall Street Journal and other places, they'll say, we're already soaking the rich because the richest 1% pay 40% of the income taxes, and 40% of Americans pay no income taxes at all. So and they put that forth because that's how Americans believe that we should be having more taxes on the rich, generally, right? But the problem with that is that it is conflating people with high incomes and people with a lot of wealth. People with high incomes do indeed pay the most taxes. So high-paid lawyers, high-paid doctors, high-paid business people, they are paying the most income taxes. But the richest Americans avoid income and thereby avoid income taxes because they don't have their inheritances are not treated as income, and the enormous growth in value of their assets is also not treated as income. And and of course, they don't pay for Social Security because they don't pay payroll taxes. By the way, the 40% of non-payers goes down to 17% if you account for the fact that working Americans support Social Security and Medicare through their payroll taxes.
I'm going to bring Julian in just a second, but someone just submitted a question asking whether we shouldn't replace the income tax with a sales tax, like the value-added tax that exists in Europe, and whether that might be a more equitable way of...
Right. So a lot of people promote this idea of a sales tax. I think there's two problems with it. One is when we're talking about the very wealthy, right? These are people who have like more than $100 billion. They are never going to consume anything that's going to start eating away. They might, their yachts and all of those things don't even come close to their wealth. So I don't think a sales tax could serve as a substitute. It could certainly serve as an addendum to our tax system. I think the problem is how it gets written. We just have no historical experience with it. And also states very much rely on sales taxes. So it would involve a significant rejiggering of our system.
I mean, Julian, of course, the system is different in Germany, and I invite you to comment on the German system if you'd like to, but I sort of want to come back to the role that money plays in politics, both in the United States, the focus of your book, but also in Germany. And it seems as if money has always been important in politics and in political influence. But in recent decades, wealth has become an increasingly decisive factor in who ultimately gets elected in terms of the election campaigns, campaign finance here in the US, and also what sort of policies are ultimately advanced. And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how you see this relationship between money and political power evolving in the US, and since you're in Germany, whether there are any comparisons with the German system as well.
Yeah. So I feel like the German system is set up a little differently because we have public financing of campaigns.
Yeah.
Also, like a much smaller pool of high net worth individuals who would be able to pump as much money in campaigning, like as some Americans do. I mean, Elon Musk spent almost $300 million on campaign contributions on getting Republicans elected in last year's campaign season. That's an unheard of amount of money in America as well as in the rest of the world. I feel the effects of this reliance on big donor checks at this point has the effect that the priorities of the broader population of some sort of being lost, because like I think now it's up to $3,500 that the average American, a normal American can contribute to a normal campaign. That's not going to bring you a lot of attention, right? We've seen this a couple of times in the last couple of decades, ever since Citizens United, pretty much. The Supreme Court decision that legalized super PACs or made outside contributions limitless. We've seen it again and again that usually like the better financed candidate wins an election, right? It's 97, 96%. If you rely on contributions from the general population, you might outrace your opponent, but a super PAC can sort of match that or save you financially from being defeated through that way. So that means that the reliance or the importance of the people being able to cut big checks becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So their priorities get more play. This works on both sides of the aisle, by the way. I don't think we've seen the same effects in Germany yet. Obviously, big donations play a part here too, but it's nowhere near as close, nowhere close to what the American system has experienced in the last decade and a half.
Mm-hmm. A question to both of you. I mean, do you think that the growing role of billionaires and donor-advised funds and other foundations in public life represent sort of a new form of political power, or is this a natural continuation of older patterns of influence, and we're just seeing them take hold in a different way today?
Well, I mean, I would say it's the size of the contributions. It's just enormous. The amount of wealth controlled by the wealthiest 1% is extraordinary. So just to put it in context, in 2024, the total amount of revenue that the country took in from all sources, tariffs, corporate taxes, income taxes, payroll taxes, was $5 trillion. And the country spent about $7 trillion. And so we had a shortfall of $2 trillion, a little bit under that. Meanwhile, the richest 1% of Americans owned $50 trillion. Mm-hmm. It's just enormous. It's a staggering amount relative to the size of government and the size of wealth owned by everybody else. And so it's, that power and the fact that the power is undiminished by taxes, like even political giving, people can create a 501c4 special purpose charity and they can save capital gains taxes and estate and gift taxes and essentially get subsidies from the rest of Americans for their contribution. So it's definitely out of control in a way today that it has never been in the past.
And I feel that that's exactly what protects this influence, this power is what protects the system, right? The super rich are able to shield off any attempts of taxing their income or their wealth because they have this sway over the political process that is being bought by a very small amount if you look at their total net worth. So what Elon Musk, I said again before, $300 million, that's not a lot of money from Elon Musk's vantage point, but it has the effect of calcifying pretty much the system in a way that sort of makes reform almost untenable or impossible structurally.
I won't go with impossible. I can't give up on the country yet. I do think that, the recent changes, the election of Mamdani, the affordability crisis that's just raging throughout the United States in terms of healthcare, education, everything, food, childcare. I think it is possible that change will come about, but I think the first step will come to educate the public that the system isn't working.
I feel this is going to be exceedingly difficult right now because of the legal status of Citizens United, right? In the past, you had pressure from below, and that was answered by action from above. Progressive era following the Gilded Age, stuff like that. Now you have a Supreme Court decision that says outside spending in elections cannot be capped at any point. So I feel maybe impossible might be a bit of too strong a word, but I think the lift is much heavier than it has been a couple of decades ago.
Right. But those campaign finance limits were only put in place in the 1970s. So there weren't those limits beforehand, right? They were put in place and then they were knocked down by the Supreme Court. But before then,
Well,
there weren't. But I
you did
agree. I
advance
mean,
your corporate money before.
it's hard to thread the needle and see how change can happen.
Mhm.
But I just think that we have seen such enormous swings, uh, pendulum swings, and in every country, these pendulum swings are happening. So to ways that were kind of unimaginable before. And so I have to hope that they can swing in this other direction.
But then let me ask, where do you think we should draw the line between sort of more legitimate political participation and support and disproportionate influence that takes hold as a result of these massive amounts
Right.
of giving?
And I mean, one thing is that in terms of the giving, like in the Wisconsin case, Musk actually, there was a backlash against him, right? And the
Right.
person he supported did not get elected.
Right.
So, so I do think that the public, when they see this type of thing, doesn't like it for
I
whatever
totally
that's
agree
right.
with that.
What's
I
that?
totally agree with that. My impression is that Elon Musk is a very special case because
Yeah,
most billionaires or most people funding campaigns from the outside do not put on a cheese head and jump on
right.
a stage and present themselves and insert themselves so clearly into a campaign. It mostly
Yeah,
happens, obviously, uh, outside the purview of the public. You can obviously find the filings later, and you can wonder where some super PAC ads are coming
yeah,
from, but it's not as overt. So
right.
that's why I think this Wisconsin case, I read in the book that the Wisconsin election would be a great place to stop this book and to finish it, to just
Yeah,
sort of describe, see, the people can and
yeah,
overcome this. But I feel it's more complicated than that.
yeah. I think you're right. And I think the other problem, of course, is the way that information is relayed, probably all around the world, in very siloed ways, so
Mhm.
that it's hard to reach the country as a whole because so often people are getting information from their own preferred biased sources.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, it sounds like it becomes sort of an educational issue, right? Or a media literacy issue as well, of making sure that you have a better informed public,
Right.
so that people can make better decisions, vote
And we
along
do
their
see in the
interests.
United States, there's a big anti-billionaire. I mean, you see it on dresses, you see, tax the rich shows up everywhere. So there's definitely a sentiment
Mhm.
that the rich have too much power. I mean,
But it seems, Ray, as if you feel like even though there's that sentiment, that it's more of a fledgling sentiment and not as widely seen or perceived, right? I mean, part of your book really focuses on systems that are in place that are hidden in plain sight, if you
right.
will, that people just do not see, but these are tools that the ultra rich are able to take advantage of because they know about these loopholes. So how does one sort
Yeah.
of shed light? I guess it would be interesting to hear a couple of examples of some
Yeah.
of the most
So, I mean, one
striking.
interesting one I think is, um, Warren Buffett has been kind of the avuncular, good guy billionaire. And but his proposal, the Buffett rule, so he had a proposal that he wrote this op-ed that said, it's terrible. He pays taxes at a lower rate than his secretary. And so, I credit him with making that statement. The problem is he then made a proposal that was that therefore all income over a certain amount should be taxed at ordinary income rates and not capital gains rates. And then Barack Obama, great president, starts touting this as the solution to our problem. The problem is that because people, that rule would have done very, very little to impose taxes on the richest Americans, because the richest Americans avoid taxes by avoiding income. It's not a matter of rates. And so there's like an example where something has been kind of put forth to the public that really wasn't accurate and would not have solved the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so that's one example of a sort of a problematic situation. And of course, the other one was the famous attack on the estate tax, the undermining of the estate tax. In the 1990s, 18 of the country's richest families got together to push for repeal of the estate tax. And it was interesting because as I talk about in my book, they could already avoid income taxes, right? They could avoid salaries, avoid sales, and thereby avoid income taxes. But the estate tax, they couldn't avoid because it was sort of a well-maintained tax, had been fortified by Congress several times, even under Republican presidents. However, these 18 families put together this campaign where they hired this guy by the name of Frank Luntz to basically create this massive campaign to get the public to see the estate tax as their problem. Even though it only applied to 1% to 2% of the population, they managed to turn the whole public against it by reframing it as a death tax, right? Making it sound like something that comes for everyone and something that's kind of mean, and saying it hurts family farms and businesses. And they put forth people like this Chester Thigpen, who was a Christmas tree farmer, grandchild of slaves. And he said, this estate tax is going to affect my ability to pass on my business. It was completely false. When he died, he wasn't subject to the estate tax at all. But the wealthy families financed this campaign, and they hid behind working class Americans to make it seem like it was a working class issue. And that was hugely effective in terms of delegitimating the estate tax in the United States. So today, it has not been kept up at all. It's really just it's a tattered mess, and it really imposes hardly any burdens while it provides cover for the rich.
Mm-hmm. So shifting gears a little bit and thinking about this concentration of wealth, Julian, in your book you argue that just having this concentration of wealth is actually contributing to democratic decline, and I think it would be interesting to hear sort of what mechanisms you see in place that contribute to that democratic decline.
So if you look at what I mentioned, the reliance of the political process on contributions by a small subset of the public, that means that sort of political contests are being bought out pretty much between two small, non-representative groups of people who have their priorities that might not necessarily be shared by the general public. Let's talk about antitrust, for example. The Biden administration came in, appointed Lina Khan as chair of the FTC in order to sort of get some countermeasures to trust monopolistic tendencies that she saw at some bigger corporations, obviously. And what happened when Kamala Harris took over the campaign from Joe Biden, there was loud mumbling between the donor class that Lina Khan should not be reappointed. Now, you can have that view, obviously, there's nothing wrong with having this view, but the fact that somebody who was subject to to possible regulation or possible trial or a possible process has such a loud voice in voicing their opinion towards like a federal public employee, that's concerning because Vice President Harris didn't say anything to that. She didn't defend Lina Khan. She didn't say she's going to stay in place. She didn't say she's going to go. But she felt unsure if she apparently she felt unsure if she should make a call at all. So the reliance on money sort of dampens conversation. It dampens debate. It dampens the exchange of views and opinions. And that's the risk in a democracy. I think there's this by the sociologist, a book about oligarchy. It's called Oligarchy. So the name's in the title. That described the United States at this point as a so-called civil oligarchy. What does that mean? It means that oligarchs don't rule directly. Like, oligarchs are not empowered by themselves. There's certain exceptions to that. Michael Bloomberg might be an example for that because he's obviously one of the richest men on the planet, and he ran New York City quite successfully for 12 years. But he's not governing as an oligarch. That's just. But the thing is, the oligarchs don't need to govern in their own right following Winters. He says that their interests are being safeguarded by the system because it is set up in a way that safeguards it. And that's not exactly what democracy usually means, right? It's the interest of the whole population should be represented in a democracy. And that was the original idea when you read Federalist Papers and stuff like that. Even though obviously the original setup of the Constitution was also not exactly something that addressed the concerns of all the people in the land. But yeah, that's why I think it's this concentration of wealth and the influence of companies is dangerous.
And also, if you add to that the control of the media by the richest Americans, you look at what Jeff Bezos is doing at the Washington Post, and you know, and you don't know what type of soft power they're using in other places to have favorable things.
Yeah, I was going to say, at the end of the day, you know, from what both of you have written, but it comes across particularly in Julian's book, it doesn't necessarily have to do with governing, although there are the cases like Michael Bloomberg and Elon Musk who had roles in government. It has to do with the influence that these individuals have, right? And that is incredibly strong because they're able to shape perception and shape policy.
I'm having an interesting experience with Amazon where they are not carrying enough of my books, and can't help but wonder whether the fact that I keep saying Jeff Bezos doesn't pay taxes is having an effect on that. One just can't know because you know, it's all the wealthy exert their power behind the scenes.
Julian, do you sort of see similar patterns of influence emerging in Europe, or is this a uniquely American thing, both in scope and in scale?
Maybe the scope and scale. Well, obviously there's like a lot of attention being paid to rich donors in European countries, right? We have this example that comes to mind right now is actually the AfD has a couple of very wealthy donors behind them. Usually people of great means, obviously, and successful entrepreneurs that sort of try to shape German society this way now. That's also like it's an interesting tidbit in my research was like it's when you look at the United States, it's not always that people giving a lot of money want something in return. That's usually the case. Like most, just like I talked to Russ Feingold, the former senator from Wisconsin, said our Democratic super donors also like low taxes, right? But there's other examples too. There's Timothy Mellon, for example, who never asked for anything from Donald Trump as far as publicly known, but still funded his campaign with a mind-boggling amount of money. He doesn't even answer calls or wants to. He doesn't participate in donor summits and stuff like that. He just sends a check because he likes what Trump is doing. So some people just want to shape like put their stamp on the country without having a specific ask, while others have a very specific ask. Taxes is obviously the most obvious one, but it's not certainly not the only one. And I think in Germany, in Europe, the system is set up a little differently, but obviously people of great means find a way to shape public discourse and public policy also in Europe. It's different, but it rhymes, I guess.
Mm-hmm. You've both talked a little bit about sort of there being a perception among some people in society in the US that there is this outsized influence that certain high net worth individuals have. How do you think individual citizens or even civil society organizations can kind of push back at that outsized role of the super rich in political life?
I guess the most important thing is to draw attention to this subject. As I mentioned, as Ray mentioned, Elon Musk trying to buy a seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court was hugely unpopular. People didn't like it. And people, like if you look at polls in the United States, people hate this influence of super rich. There's like huge majorities in both parties saying that billionaires' influence in politics is a threat to democracy. I didn't come up with that. So if you shine a light on it, people tend not to accept it. But the system is set up in a way that it's very hard to fight back. I mean, I guess, yeah, you can try to out-organize it, and sometimes that works, but sometimes it doesn't.
And I totally agree. It's all about shining. All we can do is shine a light on it. And if you do shine a light, it does make a difference in terms of how people feel. And I think the same thing happens in philanthropy is another area in the United States, right? Where if you look at it, broadly speaking, people think, oh, philanthropy, that's great. Look at that person, they're so generous. Look at the Giving Pledge, they're so generous. But if you actually look at the way our rules work, they don't really provide any assurance. They provide assurance of tax benefits, but they don't provide any assurance of the money actually getting to charity. And because the rules, need to be reformed. But so when we think like, oh, that's great, they gave money to their foundation and that's all they needed to do. I think that as people get educated like that about how bad the rules are, they do want there to be change.
Can you talk a little bit more about what kinds of reforms or policy changes could actually curb influence of big money in a meaningful way without then infringing free speech or participation rights of those individuals?
Well, yeah, Julian, why don't you speak about that now?
So again, Senator Feingold has the idea of saying the parties need the law is the law. Given Citizens United the way it was decided, it's going to be very hard to implement certain rules unless you overturn that decision, which means probably huge changes in the composition of the Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment, which is both probably something that's more of a generational project. That's something that can happen right now. His idea to how to counter this was to sort of put it front and center in your politics. So his suggestion for the Democratic Party was to sort of reject outside spending once and for all, just to sort of run on the rejection of, as he calls it, corruption. The thing is, when I talk to Democratic strategists and obviously also Republican strategists, but in this case, stick with the Democrats, they say we can't do that. We can't unilaterally disarm. We can't fight with one hand tied behind our backs. And one guy put it to, he just looked at me, raised his eyebrow and said, well, he lost, didn't he? So I feel it's a very, very heavy lift.
Mm-hmm. Ray, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I only have to add that we could easily reform our tax system in a way that imposed at least required more reasonable more reasonable contributions from the wealthiest Americans. So I think that there would be simple reforms that could do that. One of them would be to get rid of the estate tax and instead tax inheritances as income, bring it all into the income tax system, which is actually a much more well-maintained system. And also to make sure that we tax these enormous gains in property that are taking place that under the US system need never be taxed. But we should provide that, like they do in Canada, that the gains are taxed whenever the property is transferred, either during life or at death. And that would make a big difference to bring the wealthy Americans into the tax system. Of course, it would reduce their wealth somewhat, but we would need to have the campaign finance reforms that Julian mentioned in order for it to have a significant impact.
Mm-hmm. One of our viewers, this is going in a slightly different direction, but one of our viewers asks where the line is between campaign finance and supporting political campaigns and outright corruption, right? There seems to be a lot of gray area there right now, and he uses the example of billionaires helping to finance a new ballroom at the White House. But where is that sort of line for each of you?
So I feel the campaign finance law in the United States that regulates real contributions to campaigns is actually pretty well maintained. There's a cap. I think it's, I don't know, $3,500 per person. And it's like, that's obviously a lot of money for a lot of people. And it's money that you can pool and you can run a great campaign on it if you get enough people to sort of contribute that amount of money to you. But if 1 or 2 or 12 donors don't show up, or if you do something that is not in line with their expectations and they withhold their funds, it doesn't really affect your campaign, right? So having a structure like that is, I think, completely unproblematic. When it comes to larger contributions, the question is, at what point does it turn to corruption? I guess when you ask for something in return. That's above what normal politics entails. I guess when you look at the ballroom, I mean, it used to be the Trump Hotel in DC, right? That some companies just booked their rooms there in hopes of being viewed favorably by the administration. Obviously, I can't prove their indirect links, but that's something that supposedly happened. I don't know. I think it's difficult to say to one company or to one organization to stop doing that when others are doing it. It's sort of this, since this avenue of sort of influencing outcomes is open, it sort of taints the whole process, because obviously nobody stays clean when you start playing in this area.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, everybody wants to curry favor with billionaires. There's just and so you just see it happening all the time, right? It's like free stuff for billionaires, because that's what rules the world. And so it's very hard to say that a lot of times people don't have to ask for what they want. Things are just done for them to make it the world that they want it to be. And I think that we need to recognize that more honestly.
Mm-hmm. So sort of looking ahead, and Ray, you started to talk about this a little bit with your comments about reforming the estate tax and the inheritance tax. I guess, for each of you, if there was one aspect of the relationship between money and politics that you could redesign, whether it's, through the tax system, through laws, through culture, or even public norms, what would that be, and why?
I mean, that this is a big problem about the influence of money in politics. And my corner of the world of the tax benefits, this is like the fact that people are actually getting tax benefits for influencing government for their benefit, right? I think that would be something I would absolutely change. There's the idea that they're called 501c4 organizations provide capital gains and gift tax benefits is insane. It's one thing to say that it's bad enough to have a system where Elon Musk and other billionaires can use their money to influence politics. But the idea that they're going to use our money too, strikes me as just really too horrible to stand. So that would be one intervention I would really want to see happen.
Mhm. Julian, what about for you? If you know, having done this work to put this book together, after following sort of this relationship between money and politics and power, if there was one thing that you could um, redesign, recalibrate, what do you think that would be?
So I think if you're looking at attainable goals with some stuff that can happen quickly, I think the FEC needs a sort of stronger mandate or needs to do their job a little more forcefully. There's even the author of the Citizens United decision, and Justice Kennedy, once said on the podium that it doesn't work as prescribed. The idea was that outside money cannot be regulated because it's speech, but it's not going to be corrupting because it's public. And it really isn't. So it takes forever for stuff to be published, to be um, filed, or at least to be made public after it's been filed. And this is something that could change. I like the example in the last campaign, there was a small but significant intervention by something called RBG PAC. The name obviously referred to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it didn't do a lot of stuff, but it's ran some ads and published some web ads about how Donald Trump and Ruth Bader Ginsburg supposedly had the same position on Roe v. Wade. Because Justice Ginsburg was not a fan of the reasoning behind how Roe v. Wade was decided, but obviously supported the decision, while Donald Trump was fearing backlash for appointing the justices that ultimately overturned this decision. So there's this RBG PAC out there that was sort of targeting ads towards suburban women and trying to sort of blunt the impact of the Roe overturn rule towards Trump. It turned out the funder behind the RBG PAC was Elon Musk. That was made public a couple of weeks after the election when it no longer had any effect on it. I think if this stuff was being made public immediately after, why do we have to wait until after election day to find out where some money is coming from? It's again, like Ray said, it's sort of, it needs to be front and center. People need to see what's happening, and I think then you can have a democratic response to it.
It's an unbelievable story. I hadn't heard that.
But both of you talked about increasing awareness, right, and making the public, making citizens more aware of what's happening and giving them a better understanding, but then probably also empowering them in a way to let them know what they can actually do beyond writing to their elected representatives and saying there are these injustices. One of our viewers wrote that there's big money on both sides of the aisle. So why does it matter? It sort of balances out in the end. I'd be interested in hearing, each of you talk about whether it does balance out or whether the thumb is on the scale in one direction over the other.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing you certainly have seen that I do think that's true. The last election was really defined as our billionaires versus their billionaires, right? So, I think a lot of Americans saw it that way. The problem is that's not democracy, right? Democracy isn't like, well, whatever billionaires you happen to gather, that'll be enough for you. So it's highly problematic. And the other thing is that when it comes to the interests of the rich, there tends to be an alignment. And that's why, for example, with the estate tax, I mentioned that since 1990, Congress has not enacted a single loophole closing a single provision to close loopholes in the estate tax. That's been 35 years. There have been Democrats that have been in power in controlling both Congress and the presidency during that time, but they don't want to alienate rich people either, and that is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I feel the priorities of a certain subset of the population does not represent the interests of the whole of the population, and that would be right. It's like this is not a value judgment on any uh, group of funders out there. It's like there's an interesting quote that I found about George Soros' organization. Like the Soros organization is sort of seen as, excuse me, the metronome behind political giving on the left. Um, and it doesn't the values the source organization espouses through the Open Society Foundation and so on does not exactly align with what democratic voters want to see in a lot of places. Um, so it but the political process sort of pays a lot of attention to it. So for the Democrats, that's actually a double-edged sword that they have. They have like these big funders who give a lot of money and keep them competitive in elections, but it also sort of skewers their priorities a little bit towards that what the super rich donor class is interested in, and maybe away from something that the base might actually, who in the end has to vote for them, actually might be interested in. And on the other side is like, I don't think you'll be talking a lot about Mars exploration, if not for the specific interests of a handful of super rich people who are interested in doing this from, on one hand, on a commercial standpoint, but on the other thing, also on an ideological standpoint. The idea that space exploration is a non-political issue is far-fetched in my idea. It's the idea of building a libertarian utopia on somewhere far away from government reach. And since seasteading, the idea that Peter Thiel had for a while, didn't work out, the next idea is Mars. So public funding going towards these projects, I'm not saying there's no scientific or technological gains to be had from space exploration, but the focus that we're putting, the American system is putting on it right now, this is a function of what we're talking about here.
Let me ask each of you a closing question, a different question. And Julian, let me start with you. Do you see a realistic path forward when it comes to reforming campaign finance in the US that would survive in the current political landscape or the political environment that we're in?
Real reform, sadly, I don't, because the bar is so high for meaningful changes that I don't even with solid majorities in both chambers of Congress plus the White House, you couldn't do it because of the constitutional concerns. I think what you need to do is show that you can win outside the system. If people manage to do that on a certain scale, then I guess the idea becomes attractive. But so far, I mean, Zohran Mamdani had a super PAC too. So it's I'm not hopeful that this is a goal that can be achieved in the short term.
But I guess then the question is that something that can be achieved in the longer term, and what sort of a timeline, what sort of a horizon does one have to set up for that? And this then relates to the question I wanted to ask you, Ray. We haven't really talked about transparency, and I'm per se, and I'm curious whether you think that we would benefit from stronger rules around transparency in the US when it comes to giving to political causes. You talked about 501c4s as being a vehicle or an instrument. Do you think that there's a need there for more transparency?
The transparency issue is really a challenging one because a lot of bad things happen without transparency, but there's a kind of a strong public story that one can tell. So whenever this came up with respect to contributions to private foundations, and those who want transparency argued, well, there was a problem when people were supporting the NAACP, an organization for that supported voting rights for Black Americans, that they had to hide their membership list, and because people were being harmed. They use that type of image, right, to say that giving privately is important because you have to be able to support unpopular causes. And so it's so transparency becomes a very complicated issue in the United States. And I think that, and particularly as the country is more and more polarized, right? We see this now, and we saw it before, where there might be criticisms from the left for people supporting organizations on the right. Now we see it now with Donald Trump going after donors on the left. It's a challenge. I don't think that there's an easy answer to the transparency question.
Well, thank you. I mean, obviously, you've both given us a lot to think about, and I want to thank both of you for this very thought-provoking exchange. As I said at the outset, your books sort of come at some of the same issues from very different angles and very different perspectives, and it was fascinating to have the two of you together to talk about what continues to be a big issue in our democracy for sure. And I think we can see traces of this elsewhere as well. So a big thanks to both of you for spending this time with us, and of course for writing your books.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be here.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.